In the stillness of dawn, before the heat of the Egyptian sun would rise to dominate the sky, life among the ordinary people of the Nile Valley slowly began to stir. You might imagine the grandeur of the pharaohs, the towering pyramids, and the golden treasures buried deep within tombs. But beyond those monuments of power and eternity lay the heartbeat of Egypt, the lives of ordinary men and women who tilled the soil, fished the river, and carried out the endless cycle of daily survival. Their stories are quieter than the tales of kings, but without them, Egypt's mighty civilization could not have endured for thousands of years. The Nile was everything. For farmers, the river was not just water. It was time itself. Its annual flood brought rich, dark silt that nourished the fields. Each year, villagers waited anxiously to see how high the waters would rise. A generous flood meant full granaries, bread on the table, and security through the lean months. A poor flood, too high or too low, spelled hunger, debt, and desperation. And so, as the first light of day reached across the riverbanks, men could be seen stepping out into the fields, simple tools in hand, their feet sinking into the damp earth that had been left behind by the receding waters. These tools were not the gleaming bronze of soldiers or nobles, but wooden plows pulled by oxen, hand-carved sickles with blades of sharpened flint, and baskets woven from reeds. Their clothing was simple, linen tunics often worn thin from the sun and the labor of years. Around them, women and children carried jars of water, fetched from the canals and irrigation ditches that split the land into neat plots. Farming was not just work, it was survival, an unbroken rhythm handed down through generations. One might picture the farmers bent over the soil, pressing seeds into the damp earth with practiced hands. Barley and emmer wheat were the staples. These grains would be ground into flour, baked into bread, and brewed into beer, the very foundation of the Egyptian diet. The air would carry the low sound of voices, men calling to one another, women humming as they worked, children chasing after each other near the edges of the field. It was not glamorous, but it was life. And as the sun rose higher, fishermen began their day on the Nile. With narrow boats carved from papyrus or wood, they pushed off into the calm current, casting nets wide into the glittering water. The Nile teemed with life: tilapia, catfish, perch, eels. Some fished with hooks made from bone or copper, baited with scraps of bread or meat. Others used woven traps lowered into the shallows. Fishing was not only a trade, it was a daily necessity. Salted and dried fish could last for months, carried inland to villages far from the river's edge. And for those who lived by the water, a good catch meant the difference between hunger and contentment. But life for the ordinary Egyptian was not always so free. Many labored not for themselves but for others. Servants worked in the households of the wealthy, tending to chores from grinding grain to fetching water. They were not slaves in the harshest sense, but they were bound to service, their time and labor belonging to their masters. True slaves also existed, war captives, prisoners, or those sold into bondage. For them, life was harsher still. They could be made to toil in quarries under the burning sun, hauling stones for monuments, or in workshops, shaping bricks of mud and straw. Their voices are barely recorded, but in the silence of history, we can imagine their exhaustion, their longing, and the weight of survival pressed upon them. And yet, even within this hard life, there was rhythm, tradition, and community. In the villages, mud brick houses lined narrow paths, clustered close for shade and safety. The houses were small, with few furnishings beyond reed mats, clay jars, and low stools. Inside, the smell of baking bread mixed with the sharp tang of fish drying in the sun. Women pounded grain with heavy stones, their arms strong from years of repetition. Children played with toys carved from wood or shaped from clay, imitating the lives of their parents, pretending to farm, to fish, to cook. Laughter rose from these games, a reminder that even in hardship, joy found its place. At midday, the sun grew fierce and work slowed. Farmers sought shade under palm trees. Fishermen pulled their boats ashore. The land shimmered with heat, and in the distance, mirages played tricks on the eye. Life paused in these hours, just as it does in many hot lands. Bread was shared, often coarse and rough, eaten with onions, garlic, and perhaps a few figs, if fortune allowed. Beer, thick and nourishing, was poured into clay cups. It was not strong alcohol as we know it today, but a filling, almost porridge-like drink that quenched thirst and gave energy for the long hours ahead. By evening, as the sky softened into hues of orange and red, the cycle began to close. Farmers carried their tools home. Fishermen mended their nets, preparing for the next day. In the villages, lamps fueled by animal fat or vegetable oil flickered to life, casting dim light upon the walls. Songs rose softly, prayers to the gods for fertile land, for protection from illness, for strength to endure. But underlying all of this was the awareness of hierarchy. Ordinary Egyptians lived under the shadow of the pharaoh and the noble class. Taxes were demanded, not in coins, but in grain, livestock, and labor. Scribes arrived to measure the harvest, recording every bundle, every jar, every loaf owed to the state. And if the harvest was poor, the burden did not lessen. Debt could bind a family for generations. Yet the people accepted this as the order of the world, as natural as the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile. Still, in their own ways, they found dignity. They honored their ancestors, leaving offerings of bread, beer, and small trinkets at family tombs. They told stories by firelight, tales of gods and spirits who walked among them. They laughed, they quarreled, they fell in love, they endured loss. Their lives may seem humble compared to the splendor of kings, but they were the true foundation of Egypt's greatness. Without their labor, without their endurance, no pyramid could have risen, no temple could have stood, no dynasty could have survived. So if you close your eyes and listen closely, perhaps you can hear the faint echoes of their world, the creak of wooden plows, the splash of nets into water, the low murmur of prayers spoken at dusk. It is a quiet story, an ordinary story, but it is the story that truly sustained one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever known. As night began to descend upon the Nile Valley, the daily labors of Egypt's ordinary people slowly faded into softer rhythms. The sky over the desert horizon turned deep orange, then purple, and finally a vast canopy of stars revealed itself, glittering brighter than most people today could ever imagine. Without modern lights to obscure them, the heavens stretched endlessly above the villages, each star seeming close enough to touch. For the farmers, the fishermen, the servants, and the slaves, this was the hour of rest, of gathering, and of quiet reflection. The small mud brick houses, clustered together in tight groups, came alive with dim glows. Oil lamps flickered inside, their flames dancing upon clay walls and reed mats. Families gathered to share their final meal of the day. It was not a banquet, but something simple. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat, dipped into bowls of beans or lentils. Sometimes there would be fish, salted and preserved earlier, or vegetables pulled from the small gardens that clung to the edges of the fertile soil. Figs and dates were a treat if they were in season. The aroma of garlic and onions drifted through the narrow passageways of the village, mixing with the warm smell of baking bread and the faint smoke from cooking fires. Conversations in these homes were not about politics or wars. They were about the flood of the Nile, about how the crops might grow, about the health of the oxen or the stubbornness of a donkey, about a child who had been coughing, or the small joys of a good fishing day. These were the concerns of real life, spoken quietly in the soft light of evening. Children often played outside until the last light was gone, their laughter echoing through the narrow paths between homes. They played with clay dolls, little carved animals, or simple balls of stuffed linen. They pretended to be their parents, imitating the farmer sowing seeds or the fisherman casting nets. Their games were innocent mirrors of the lives they would one day inherit. When darkness deepened, mothers called them inside, their voices firm but gentle, gathering them to safety before the desert night grew too cold. Religion was never far from the hearts of these people. In the evening, small offerings might be placed at household shrines. A piece of bread, a sip of beer, a handful of flowers, simple gifts left for the gods or for the spirits of ancestors. The ordinary Egyptian believed the world of the living and the world of the dead were intertwined, that their ancestors could bless or curse their lives depending on how they were remembered. And so, even the poorest families took time to whisper prayers, to bow their heads, and to honor those who came before. Outside, the village itself seemed to breathe in unison. Dogs barked at shadows along the edges of the fields. Donkeys brayed softly, tethered near their homes. The Nile, flowing steadily in the distance, carried the soft sound of moving water, a lullaby that had comforted generations. Fishermen, returning late, might still be seen pulling in their boats, tired but content after long hours on the river. Some sat by the water's edge, mending torn nets by the glow of the moon, their hands moving automatically, almost rhythmically, as if guided by memory more than thought. Every so often, the night would be punctuated by music. A neighbor plucking the strings of a lute-like instrument, a group of young men beating rhythm on small drums, or women singing songs as they worked with their hands. The melodies were simple, repetitive, but haunting. These songs carried stories of gods who ruled the sky, of pharaohs who conquered distant lands, of love found and lost in the villages themselves. Music, like the stars above, connected everyone to something greater than themselves. The cooler air of night allowed for gatherings. Neighbors might sit together outside their homes, sharing stories while sipping from clay cups of beer. The conversations often turned into tales passed down through generations. Legends of Ra, the sun god who sailed across the heavens in his boat. Of Osiris, who ruled the land of the dead. Of Isis, the mother goddess whose love could heal even the broken. These were not just myths to entertain. They were woven into the very fabric of daily life, shaping how people understood sickness, harvest, storms, and fate itself. But even as religion and story offered comfort, the reality of hierarchy remained. Scribes and officials, agents of the state, sometimes came even at night, ensuring that the village gave its proper share of labor or produce. To defy them was unthinkable. People bowed, nodded, and answered respectfully, hiding their own weariness. For the ordinary Egyptian, obedience was not just a rule, it was survival. Still, the village night had a kind of peace. After the meals were eaten, after the songs were sung, after the lamps were dimmed, a hush fell. Families lay down on reed mats, side by side, sometimes on rooftops under the stars to escape the heat trapped inside the mud brick walls. The desert air cooled their skin, and the sky above, vast and eternal, seemed to watch over them. As sleep came, dreams carried them into another world. Perhaps they dreamed of fertile floods, of bountiful harvests, of strong children growing into adulthood. Perhaps they dreamed of the gods walking among them, offering guidance or warning. Or perhaps they simply dreamed of rest itself, the relief from a day of endless labor. For in truth, the life of an ordinary Egyptian was not marked by moments of grandeur, but by cycles, day after day, season after season. Work, food, family, prayer, and rest. It was a rhythm as eternal as the Nile, and like the river, it flowed quietly, endlessly, sustaining a civilization that would stand for thousands of years. And so, in the calm of the night, with the soft whispers of families settling down and the steady murmur of the river in the distance, ancient Egypt's ordinary people lived their lives. They were unseen by history's monuments, unnamed in the great scrolls, but in their small, simple existence lay the foundation of one of the most enduring cultures humanity has ever known.
As night began to descend upon the Nile Valley, the daily labors of Egypt's ordinary people slowly faded into softer rhythms. The sky over the desert horizon turned deep orange, then purple, and finally a vast canopy of stars revealed itself, glittering brighter than most people today could ever imagine. Without modern lights to obscure them, the heavens stretched endlessly above the villages, each star seeming close enough to touch. For the farmers, the fishermen, the servants, and the slaves, this was the hour of rest, of gathering, and of quiet reflection. The small mud brick houses, clustered together in tight groups, came alive with dim glows. Oil lamps flickered inside, their flames dancing upon clay walls and reed mats. Families gathered to share their final meal of the day. It was not a banquet, but something simple. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat, dipped into bowls of beans or lentils. Sometimes there would be fish, salted and preserved earlier, or vegetables pulled from the small gardens that clung to the edges of the fertile soil. Figs and dates were a treat if they were in season. The aroma of garlic and onions drifted through the narrow passageways of the village, mixing with the warm smell of baking bread and the faint smoke from cooking fires. Conversations in these homes were not about politics or wars. They were about the flood of the Nile, about how the crops might grow, about the health of the oxen or the stubbornness of a donkey, about a child who had been coughing, or the small joys of a good fishing day. These were the concerns of real life, spoken quietly in the soft light of evening. Children often played outside until the last light was gone, their laughter echoing through the narrow paths between homes. They played with clay dolls, little carved animals, or simple balls of stuffed linen. They pretended to be their parents, imitating the farmer sowing seeds or the fisherman casting nets. Their games were innocent mirrors of the lives they would one day inherit. When darkness deepened, mothers called them inside, their voices firm but gentle, gathering them to safety before the desert night grew too cold. Religion was never far from the hearts of these people. In the evening, small offerings might be placed at household shrines: a piece of bread, a sip of beer, a handful of flowers, simple gifts left for the gods or for the spirits of ancestors. The ordinary Egyptian believed the world of the living and the world of the dead were intertwined, that their ancestors could bless or curse their lives depending on how they were remembered. And so even the poorest families took time to whisper prayers, to bow their heads, and to honor those who came before. Outside, the village itself seemed to breathe in unison. Dogs barked at shadows along the edges of the fields. Donkeys brayed softly, tethered near their homes. The Nile, flowing steadily in the distance, carried the soft sound of moving water, a lullaby that had comforted generations. Fishermen returning late might still be seen pulling in their boats, tired but content after long hours on the river. Some sat by the water's edge, mending torn nets by the glow of the moon, their hands moving automatically, almost rhythmically, as if guided by memory more than thought. Every so often, the night would be punctuated by music. A neighbor plucking the strings of a lute-like instrument, a group of young men beating rhythm on small drums, or women singing songs as they worked with their hands. The melodies were simple, repetitive, but haunting. These songs carried stories of gods who ruled the sky, of pharaohs who conquered distant lands, of love found and lost in the villages themselves. Music, like the stars above, connected everyone to something greater than themselves. The cooler air of night allowed for gatherings. Neighbors might sit together outside their homes, sharing stories while sipping from clay cups of beer. The conversations often turned into tales passed down through generations, legends of Ra, the sun god, who sailed across the heavens in his boat, of Osiris, who ruled the land of the dead, of Isis, the mother goddess whose love could heal even the broken. These were not just myths to entertain. They were woven into the very fabric of daily life, shaping how people understood sickness, harvest, storms, and fate itself. But even as religion and story offered comfort, the reality of hierarchy remained. Scribes and officials, agents of the state, sometimes came even at night, ensuring that the village gave its proper share of labor or produce. To defy them was unthinkable. People bowed, nodded, and answered respectfully, hiding their own weariness. For the ordinary Egyptian, obedience was not just a rule, it was survival. Still, the village night had a kind of peace. After the meals were eaten, after the songs were sung, after the lamps were dimmed, a hush fell. Families lay down on reed mats side by side, sometimes on rooftops under the stars to escape the heat trapped inside the mud brick walls. The desert air cooled their skin, and the sky above, vast and eternal, seemed to watch over them. As sleep came, dreams carried them into another world. Perhaps they dreamed of fertile floods, of bountiful harvests, of strong children growing into adulthood. Perhaps they dreamed of the gods walking among them, offering guidance or warning. Or perhaps they simply dreamed of rest itself, the relief from a day of endless labor. For in truth, the life of an ordinary Egyptian was not marked by moments of grandeur, but by cycles, day after day, season after season. Work, food, family, prayer, and rest. It was a rhythm as eternal as the Nile, and like the river it flowed quietly, endlessly, sustaining a civilization that would stand for thousands of years. And so, in the calm of the night, with the soft whispers of families settling down, and the steady murmur of the river in the distance, ancient Egypt's ordinary people lived their lives. They were unseen by history's monuments, unnamed in the great scrolls, but in their small, simple existence lay the foundation of one of the most enduring cultures humanity has ever known. In the quiet moments between life's daily struggles, the people of ancient Egypt often turned their thoughts toward death, not in fear, but in acceptance. To them, death was not an ending, but a passage into another form of existence. The afterlife was as real as the Nile's flood or the rising sun, and it shaped the way even the humblest farmer, fisherman, or servant lived each day. For ordinary Egyptians who endured hardship and toil, the hope of an afterlife gave meaning to their struggles. They believed that beyond death, the soul could walk into the fields of reeds, a perfect version of their own land. This eternal paradise, the Nile flowed endlessly. Crops grew without labor, and families were reunited in peace. There, the pain of hunger, debt, and servitude would vanish. Such visions gave comfort to the weary, allowing them to bear the burdens of their earthly existence with patience. At the heart of these beliefs was the god Osiris, lord of the dead and ruler of the afterlife. His story was told in homes, at festivals, and by firelight, how he had once been a king upon the earth, betrayed and murdered by his jealous brother Set, and then restored to eternal life through the devotion of his wife Isis. For the people, this myth was not only divine drama, it was a promise that life could triumph over death. To live righteously, to honor the gods, and to treat others with fairness was to prepare for the judgment of Osiris. Death itself was marked with care, even for the poor. When someone passed away, neighbors gathered to mourn, filling the small homes with wailing and ritual cries. The body, though lacking the grand embalming of nobles, was still treated with respect. Wrapped in linen, sometimes with amulets of clay or faience placed near the chest, it was laid to rest in a simple grave dug into the desert's edge. The hot, dry sands preserved the remains, unintentionally giving modern historians glimpses into lives that might otherwise have been forgotten. Families brought offerings to these graves: bread, beer, vegetables, and small trinkets. They believed the spirit of the dead, the Ka, required nourishment just as the living did. To neglect the dead was to risk their anger or sadness, and so even the poorest households did what they could. A loaf of bread, a clay cup of beer, or a flower laid gently upon the sand carried profound meaning. Children were taught to remember their ancestors, to speak their names aloud, for to be remembered was to live on. In the evenings, parents might tell stories of their parents and grandparents, linking generations together in an unbroken chain. In this way, memory itself became a sacred act, ensuring that no life vanished completely. The rituals of death also reflected the order of society. Nobles and scribes could afford coffins painted with spells from the Book of the Dead, magical texts meant to guide the soul through the dangers of the underworld. The poor had no such luxuries, yet they shared the same faith. They relied on the gods' mercy, on their own good deeds, and on the prayers of their families to carry them safely to the afterlife. The journey after death was imagined in vivid detail. The soul would leave the body and stand before the hall of judgment. There, Osiris sat upon his throne, flanked by 42 judges who represented the laws of the universe. The heart of the deceased was weighed upon a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was light, free of lies and wrongdoing, the soul passed into eternal life. If it was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, the fearsome devourer, a creature part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. To ordinary Egyptians, this vision was not abstract theology, but a living guide for how to act with honesty, kindness, and respect. This belief system shaped daily life. A farmer toiling in the fields might murmur a prayer before beginning his work, not only to ensure a good harvest, but to show devotion. A fisherman casting his net might whisper thanks to the gods of the river, hoping to be judged kindly when his heart was weighed. A servant, though weary under orders, might still find comfort in believing that patience and humility would one day be rewarded in paradise. Festivals of the dead reinforced these beliefs. During the Feast of the Valley, families visited the tombs of their ancestors, bringing food, flowers, and drink. They spent time in the company of the departed, believing their spirits joined the living in a moment of reunion. Even the poorest family, without elaborate tombs or monuments, could honor their dead in this way. It was not the wealth of offerings, but the sincerity of devotion that mattered. Night after night, as stars stretched across the desert sky, people spoke quietly of their hopes for the afterlife. They dreamed of walking again with parents, of embracing children lost too soon, of living without hunger or fear. These dreams made the weight of each day more bearable, for they promised that no hardship was wasted, that endurance would be rewarded beyond the veil of death. And so, within the mud brick homes and along the sandy edges of the Nile, the ordinary Egyptians prepared for death as carefully as they lived. They knew that their names might never be carved into stone, that their faces would not be painted upon temple walls, but they believed with unshakable faith that the gods saw them, that their hearts would be judged, and that eternity might hold peace. In their humble rituals, in their whispered prayers, in the bread placed at a grave or the name spoken by a child, we glimpse the true endurance of ancient Egypt. It was not only the pharaohs who dreamed of eternity, it was the farmers, the fishermen, the servants, and the slaves, each hoping that when the scales were balanced, their hearts would be found pure, and their souls would walk forever in the green fields of paradise. At the heart of every Egyptian settlement, whether a small village or a sprawling city, there stood a place that reached beyond the ordinary rhythm of farming, fishing, and household life. These were the temples, great and small, where the people of ancient Egypt connected to their gods, where prayers rose like smoke, and where rituals bound heaven and earth together. For ordinary Egyptians, temples were not distant monuments, but living centers of community, belief, and hope. From the first light of dawn, temple courtyards stirred with activity. The grandest temples, built of stone and adorned with towering pylons, belonged to the gods of the state, Amun, Ra, Osiris, Hathor, Isis, but even the smallest villages had modest shrines, mud brick structures where local deities were honored. The scale differed, but the purpose was the same: to bridge the world of the living with the eternal realm of the divine. The priests began their day long before the sun had fully risen. Dressed in clean linen, their heads often shaved as a sign of purity, they moved quietly through sacred halls. Each ritual was carried out with precision, for it was believed that the balance of the cosmos itself depended on these acts. Statues of the gods were carefully washed, anointed with oils and dressed in fresh clothing. Offerings of bread, beer, fruit, meat, and incense were placed before them. These offerings were not symbolic. They were real food, prepared by bakers, brewers, and farmers, and brought into the temple as part of the daily cycle of devotion. For ordinary people, the temple was both mysterious and essential. Most could not enter the innermost sanctuaries where the gods were believed to dwell. That space was reserved for priests. Yet the presence of the temple reached into every life. The farmers whose grain was offered, the fishermen whose catch fed the priests, the artisans who carved statues or painted walls, all were connected to the divine through their labor. In this way, even without stepping into the sacred chambers, the ordinary man or woman still participated in maintaining the order of the universe. Outside the temple walls, courtyards and open spaces bustled with life. Vendors sold bread, beer, and small trinkets to those who came to make offerings. Families arrived carrying baskets of food, clay jars of drink, or simple tokens fashioned from reeds and clay. They placed these before altars, bowing their heads, whispering prayers for health, for rain, for protection from illness, for strong children, or for peace in the household. A mother might ask for her child to recover from a fever. A fisherman might pray for a good catch. A farmer might beg for the floodwaters to rise just enough to nourish his fields. Festivals transformed temples into centers of celebration. On holy days, the statues of the gods were carried from their sanctuaries, borne on the shoulders of priests, hidden within gilded shrines. The air filled with music, the beating of drums, the cry of flutes, the chants of hymns rising into the sky. Crowds gathered in the streets lining the procession routes, cheering, clapping, and singing. To see the god pass by, even hidden from view, was to feel blessed. People stretched out their hands hoping for a glance, a sign, a touch of divine presence. Temples also served as places of healing. Within their walls, priests who studied medicine applied herbs, salves, and chants to cure the sick. Ordinary people came with wounds, fevers, or injuries from labor, hoping for relief. Some treatments were practical, drawn from centuries of experience with plants and minerals. Others were mystical, invoking the power of the gods. A mixture of faith and medicine, of prayer and healing hands gave hope where none might otherwise exist. The temple was also a place of learning. Scribes trained within its walls, copying sacred texts, recording prayers, and preserving knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Most ordinary people were illiterate, but they knew the power of writing. To see a priest or scribe draw signs upon papyrus or stone was to witness a kind of magic, a bridge between word and eternity. Parents dreamed, however faintly, that their sons might one day rise from the fields to become scribes. Rare, but not impossible. Yet for all the grandeur, ordinary people often saw the temple in very practical terms. It was a source of food during hard times, as offerings not used by the gods were distributed among the priests and sometimes shared with the community. It was a place of shelter during festivals, of gathering during floods, and of guidance in times of uncertainty. The gods were distant, but the temple was present, its walls a constant reminder that the divine was never too far away. At night, when the rituals were finished and the priests withdrew into chambers of rest, the temple did not fall silent. Torches burned low, casting long shadows on stone walls covered in carvings of gods, kings, and sacred stories. The air smelled of lingering incense, sweet and heavy, drifting through the courtyards. Outside, villagers whispered their last prayers before returning home, confident that their offerings had been seen, their words heard. The ordinary Egyptians' connection to the temple was one of trust and dependency. They may not have understood every ritual, nor witnessed the secrets within the inner halls, but they believed deeply that these acts preserved the balance of Mayat, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. To neglect the gods was to invite chaos, drought, famine, and disease. To honor them was to ensure life, fertility, and the continuation of the world itself. So, whether through a handful of grain left at an altar, a whispered prayer in the courtyard, or a joyous dance during a festival procession, ordinary people bound themselves to their gods with every step of their lives. And though their names are lost, their devotion helped sustain the great temples whose ruins still stand against the desert winds, silent witnesses to the faith of those who once knelt humbly at their gates. Beyond the fertile fields of the Nile and the towering walls of the temples, another world thrived in ancient Egypt, the world of the craftsmen and artisans. Here, in the narrow streets of workshops and dusty yards filled with the sounds of hammering, chiseling, and weaving, ordinary men and women shaped the very fabric of Egyptian life. Unlike the grandeur of pharaohs or priests, their labor was humble, but without it, Egypt's greatness could never have existed. Each morning, as the sun rose and cast its golden light over the villages, artisans emerged to begin their work. The potter's wheel spun, turned by steady hands that had practiced the motion since childhood. Clay, pulled from the riverbanks, was molded into jars, bowls, and vessels. These were not simply objects of beauty, but necessities of daily life. Without pots to store grain, without jars to carry water, without bowls for meals, no household could function. The potter's skill was quiet, unnoticed by history's scribes, but it kept families alive. Nearby, the air echoed with the sharp ring of the stonecutter's chisel. Men hunched over blocks of limestone or granite, sweat beading on their foreheads as they struck again and again. Their hands bore the marks of endless labor, rough skin, cracked nails, swollen joints. Yet with patience and persistence, they transformed raw stone into statues of gods, tombs for the dead, and carvings for temples. Even the simplest village tomb might bear a carved doorway or offering table, crafted by men who would never see their names inscribed. Though their work endured through centuries, metalworkers, too, played a vital role. In the heat of their small forges, they melted copper or bronze, hammering it into tools, sickles for harvest, knives for kitchens, fishing hooks for river life. Some forged jewelry, delicate bracelets, amulets, and rings that carried both beauty and protective magic. A fisherman's hook, a farmer's plow, a child's toy. All were shaped by the blackened hands of these smiths. Without them, the daily rhythm of Egypt could not continue. Weavers and spinners filled another corner of this bustling world. Women sat together in shaded courtyards, spinning flax into threads, weaving it into linen on wooden looms. The linen was prized across Egypt, for clothing, for bedding, for wrappings of the dead. The finest linen might clothe priests or adorn temple statues, but even the humblest family relied on these fabrics for warmth and modesty. The sound of shuttles tapping against looms, the soft murmur of women's voices, and the rustling of linen became part of the background music of daily life. Carpenters, too, shaped the world with their tools. With saws and chisels, they built simple stools, reed mats bound with wood, beds and chests to hold food or clothing. For wealthier families, they crafted boats that skimmed across the Nile, their sails catching the wind. Even coffins for the dead came from their hands, simple or elaborate depending on what a family could afford. Their work followed people from birth to death, cradling them in life and guarding them in eternity. Artists and painters carried another responsibility, bringing color and life to walls, papyrus, and statues. In small workshops, pigments made from ground minerals, reds from ochre, blues from lapis, greens from malachite, were mixed into paints. With careful strokes, artisans decorated tomb walls with scenes of hunting, fishing, farming, and family feasts. These were not mere decorations, but promises of the afterlife, visions of paradise carried into eternity. Even if the artisans themselves were buried in simple sand graves, their hands gave the elite visions of immortality. The workshop communities were often tightly knit. Entire families worked side by side, fathers teaching sons, mothers guiding daughters. Skills passed down through generations ensured that Egypt's crafts never disappeared. In villages built for royal tomb workers, such as Deir el-Medina, archaeologists have uncovered small homes filled with the tools of artisans, showing how these people lived and labored for pharaohs' tombs. Yet similar smaller communities existed everywhere along the Nile, sustaining the ordinary needs of daily life. Life in these workshops was not easy. Hours were long, hands were worn, and pay was often meager. A potter might trade his wares for food rather than coin. A carpenter might be given grain as payment for a chest or a stool. At times, disputes broke out, workers striking against overseers if wages of bread and beer were delayed, their protests echoing through history as some of the earliest recorded labor revolts. Even in ancient times, the working poor knew the power of unity. But for all the hardship, there was pride in craftsmanship. A pot perfectly shaped, a jar that did not crack in the kiln, a carving that captured the curve of a face, a loom producing flawless linen, all brought satisfaction. Parents taught their children not only the skill, but the dignity of labor, reminding them that though their names might not be carved in temples, their work built the foundation of Egypt's glory. At day's end, as the sun sank and shadows stretched long across the desert, artisans laid down their tools. Some gathered in courtyards, sharing bread, beer, and stories. Others sat quietly, mending tools or preparing materials for the next day. Children played among scraps of wood, clay, and linen, shaping small toys that echoed the crafts of their parents. And in the stillness of night, the village workshops rested, ready to rise again with the dawn. Though history remembers pharaohs and priests, the true heartbeat of Egypt was found here, in the hands of those who shaped clay, wood, stone, and fabric. Their work touched every life, filled every home, and built every monument. Without them, the temples would have been empty shells, the tombs bare chambers, the palaces silent halls. With them, Egypt thrived, vibrant and enduring, their unseen labor echoing still across the sands of time. Food was the center of survival in ancient Egypt, a rhythm of daily life that bound rich and poor alike to the soil, the river, and the seasons. For the ordinary farmer, fisherman, and artisan, meals were not extravagant but simple, nourishing, and deeply tied to the gifts of the Nile. To understand their lives, one must walk into their kitchens, smell the bread rising, hear the crackle of fire, and see the modest gatherings around clay bowls of food at dusk. The backbone of every meal was bread. Made from emmer wheat or barley, the grains were ground into flour using stone querns, a task that fell mostly to women. Kneeling for hours, they pushed stones against stones, the sound filling every village courtyard. Dust covered their arms and faces, and fine powder clung to the air. Once ground, the flour was mixed with water, sometimes flavored with herbs, dates, or honey if available, and shaped into loaves. These loaves were baked in clay ovens or over open fires, their crusts hard, their centers dense. Bread was more than food. It was life itself, eaten at nearly every meal, sustaining the body through long hours of labor. Beer was the other constant. Unlike the strong beers of today, Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and nourishing, almost like a porridge in liquid form. Brewed from barley, it carried a sour tang and low alcohol, safe to drink even for children. Workers received beer as part of their wages, and festivals flowed with it. After a hot day in the fields or on the river, a clay cup of beer offered both refreshment and strength. In many homes, beer and bread together formed the most common meal, humble yet sustaining. Vegetables and legumes filled out the diet. Fields and gardens produced onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, beans, and lentils. These were boiled into stews or eaten raw with bread. Garlic and onions, pungent and strong, were prized for their flavor and believed to grant health and stamina. Lentils and chickpeas simmered over small fires became hearty meals for families with little else. Cucumbers and melons, grown along the edges of fields, offered relief in the blazing heat of summer. Meat was rare for ordinary Egyptians. While the wealthy dined on beef, lamb, or goose, common people relied on fish from the Nile, birds trapped in nets, or small cuts of goat and pig when fortune allowed. Families who could not afford fresh meat often dried fish or salted it for preservation. Hunting birds with throw sticks or nets was common near the marshes, and roasted quail or pigeon might occasionally grace the tables of hard-working villagers. These were treats, not daily fare. Cooking took place outdoors or in simple hearths within mud-brick homes. Clay pots, blackened by smoke, simmered with stews of beans, lentils, or fish. Flat stones served as griddles for bread, and reed baskets held vegetables waiting to be chopped. Smoke curled into the air, mingling with the scent of earth and Nile water. Children often lingered nearby, their stomachs eager, their hands reaching for scraps. Meals were communal. Families gathered around low stools or mats, dipping bread into stews, passing cups of beer, and sharing whatever was available. Fruits brought sweetness to life. Dates, figs, and grapes grew abundantly, eaten fresh or dried for storage. Honey, though precious, sweetened special dishes or drinks. Palm trees offered not only dates, but also shade and wood, making them essential to survival. On feast days, figs stuffed with nuts or bread dipped in honey might appear, a brief indulgence in lives often marked by simplicity. Feasts and festivals gave food a sacred dimension. During religious celebrations, offerings of bread, beer, and meat were made at temples, later redistributed to priests and sometimes to the people. Families prepared extra loaves, shared meals with neighbors, and celebrated with more abundance than usual. Festivals tied to the harvest, to the flooding of the Nile, or to the honoring of gods became moments of joy, where even the poorest might taste luxuries beyond their daily reach. Food also carried meaning beyond nourishment. Bread shaped into special forms was offered to the gods or placed in tombs for the afterlife. Beer jars were left at graves, ensuring the deceased would never thirst. What was eaten in life was believed to continue in eternity, so meals became prayers, acts of faith as much as survival. For the children of these households, food defined memory. The taste of warm bread, the sharp bite of onion, the sweetness of a fig. These flavors became the essence of home. For adults, the struggle to secure each meal was constant, yet so too was the comfort of gathering each night to share whatever the day had provided. Hunger was a familiar shadow, but so was resilience. And every loaf of bread represented victory over want. In the stillness of night, when fires burned low and families slept on reed mats, the smells of the day lingered. Smoke from hearths, the faint tang of beer, the sweetness of dried figs all mingled in the air of the village. Tomorrow the same cycle would begin again. Women grinding grain, men fishing or farming, children learning to share from the same clay bowl. Food was never merely a necessity. It was the thread that bound family, community, and faith together in the timeless rhythm of Egyptian life. Childhood in ancient Egypt was both fragile and full of wonder. For ordinary families, farmers, fishermen, artisans, and laborers, children were the heart of the household, both a source of joy and the promise of survival. In a world where life was often uncertain and hard, raising children meant not only teaching them how to live, but preparing them to carry the weight of tradition, labor, and faith into the future. From the moment of birth, a child's arrival was celebrated with hope. Mothers, aided by midwives or older women of the family, gave birth at home on reed mats, often with amulets and prayers nearby to protect mother and child. Life was fragile. Infant mortality was high. But every newborn was greeted as a gift from the gods. Families prayed to deities like Taweret, the hippo goddess who guarded childbirth, and Bes, the dwarf-like protector of infants and mothers. Amulets shaped like these gods were hung near beds or tied around babies' necks. Small charms against sickness and evil. In their earliest years, children wore little clothing, if any, especially in the heat of summer. Their bodies were tanned by the sun as they played near the riverbanks or in the dusty lanes of villages. Small protective charms often hung around their necks, carved from clay or faience. Their heads were shaved for cleanliness and comfort, except for a single lock of hair, the side lock of youth, that marked them as children. This style was a common sight, a cultural marker that united rich and poor alike. Childhood was short, for by the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to help with the family's work. Girls stayed close to their mothers, learning to grind grain, bake bread, fetch water, and weave linen. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, the river, or the workshops, carrying small tools, learning by watching and slowly joining in the labor. Work was play at first, then responsibility. A boy might begin by helping to herd goats, scare birds from fields, or carry baskets of clay. A girl might start by spinning threads, shaping dough, or caring for younger siblings. Yet childhood was not without joy. Egyptian children filled their days with games and laughter when duties allowed. Simple toys carved from wood or clay delighted them. Small dolls with bead hair, carved animals on wheels, clay balls, and spinning tops. Some toys were painted brightly, others left plain, but all carried the touch of a craftsman's hand. Boys played with sticks, turning them into weapons or tools, while girls shaped clay into tiny dishes for pretend meals. Play mirrored adult life, preparing children for the roles they would one day inherit. Games were common among groups of children. Wrestling, running races, and swimming in the Nile filled their afternoons. Boys often played with throwing sticks, practicing aim at targets or hunting small birds. Girls played clapping games, sang songs, and invented stories. Older children taught the younger ones, laughter echoing through the narrow lanes of villages. The Nile itself was a playground. Children splashed in its shallows, floated on reed bundles, and learned early to respect both its gifts and its dangers. Education varied depending on a family's means. Most ordinary children learned only the skills of survival: farming, fishing, weaving, cooking. But in rare cases, boys with talent or luck might be sent to school to learn writing and mathematics. Often attached to temples, scribes held high respect in society. And though most children of laborers never reached such heights, parents dreamed of it. Learning to read and write was like learning magic, opening doors that toil alone could never unlock. Girls almost never received formal schooling, but some learned household accounting or even healing skills from their mothers. Family life revolved around teaching values as much as skills. Respect for elders, obedience to parents, and devotion to the gods were instilled from the earliest years. Children listened to stories of ancestors, of gods and myths, of pharaohs and their deeds. These stories carried lessons about honesty, patience, hard work, and humility. Even before they could fully understand, children were expected to bow before shrines, to leave small offerings of bread or flowers, and to repeat prayers with their families. Discipline was strict but rooted in love. A lazy child might be scolded or even struck lightly, but always with the belief that correction built character. Parents knew that survival depended on discipline. Lazy hands could mean hunger. Careless behavior could mean danger. Yet tenderness also filled these homes. Mothers sang lullabies. Fathers lifted toddlers onto their shoulders. Older siblings cared for the young, and laughter spilled from doorways at night. In these small moments, love softened the hardness of daily labor. As children grew older, marriage and adulthood came early. By the teenage years, boys might already be laboring fully in the fields or workshops, and girls might be married, managing households of their own. Childhood was brief, but its lessons shaped the rest of life. Each generation inherited not wealth, but knowledge, the wisdom of sowing and reaping, of mending nets, of kneading dough, of raising children of their own. Even in death, the love for children endured. Tiny graves along the desert's edge, wrapped in linen and placed with small toys or amulets, testify to the grief of parents who lost them. To ordinary Egyptians, children were both joy and sorrow, hope and heartache, but always the most precious part of life. In the soft glow of firelight, as families gathered at day's end, children curled beside their parents, listening to stories, drifting into dreams. Tomorrow they would rise to chores, to play, to lessons in survival. But in those moments, surrounded by warmth and love, they lived the timeless childhood that bound together every village along the Nile. When the sun dipped low and the long day of labor was done, the people of ancient Egypt did not always retreat into silence. Life was hard, yes, but it was never without joy. Music, dance, and simple entertainments filled the evenings and festivals, weaving laughter and rhythm into the fabric of survival. For the ordinary Egyptian, these moments were as vital as bread and beer, binding families and communities together, lifting spirits after the toil of the fields. Workshops and rivers, music was everywhere. It echoed in the courtyards of homes, in the bustling streets of villages, in the wide courtyards of temples, and in the fields where farmers worked. Instruments were simple but powerful. Wooden flutes gave soft, breathy melodies. Reed pipes whistled with a sharper sound, mimicking the call of birds. Small harps, strung with sinew or gut, plucked gentle chords that drifted through the night air. Drums, hand clappers, and sistrums, a kind of rattle often shaken in worship of Hathor, provided rhythm that quickened the blood and set feet moving. Children often created their own music, banging sticks together or clapping hands in rhythm, while women sang work songs as they ground grain or wove linen. These songs were not just background noise. They were prayers, stories, lessons, and comfort. A mother's lullaby soothed her child to sleep. A farmer's chant kept pace with the steady stroke of the hoe. Fishermen on the Nile sang together, their voices carrying over the water as they hauled in heavy nets. Music stitched daily life together with harmony. Dance was equally central, a form of expression that united young and old. In village courtyards after supper, young women often gathered to dance, their steps graceful, their movements marked by swaying hips and flowing arms. Men joined with more vigorous stomps and leaps, clapping in rhythm. Sometimes the dances were playful, meant to entertain children or tease friends. At other times, they were deeply spiritual, performed during festivals or funerals to honor gods and spirits. Festivals themselves were the grand stage for music and dance. When the statues of the gods were carried out from temple sanctuaries, the air filled with drums, flutes, and chants. Ordinary people clapped, sang, and moved with the beat, swept into a current of devotion and joy. These celebrations blurred the lines between sacred and secular. The gods were honored, but the people also feasted, laughed, and danced with abandon. Even the poorest could forget their burdens for a time, carried away by the music of the crowd. Storytelling, too, was entertainment, and it often went hand in hand with music. In the evenings, elders recited tales of gods, pharaohs, or heroic ancestors, their voices rising and falling with drama. Children leaned forward, eyes wide, while adults nodded, murmuring in agreement at familiar lessons. Some stories were humorous, poking fun at foolish neighbors or lazy workers. Others were moral, teaching honesty, patience, and devotion to the gods. In these tales, laughter and wisdom mingled, passing culture from one generation to the next. Board games offered another form of joy. Senet, the most famous of Egyptian games, was played on wooden boards marked with squares, with small pieces moved by chance and strategy. Though many pharaohs were buried with fine senet boards, the game was also played in humble homes, scratched into the ground or carved into simple wooden planks. Families sat together in the evenings, moving pieces across the board, cheering wins, groaning at losses. Other games involved throwing sticks or tossing knuckle bones, simple amusements that brought smiles to tired faces. Entertainers also traveled from place to place, acrobats, jugglers, dancers, and musicians. During larger festivals, such performers amazed crowds with daring feats, balancing on hands, tossing balls or sticks, bending their bodies into impossible shapes. These spectacles brought delight to rich and poor alike. Even in small villages, Neighbors sometimes staged performances, men dressing as animals, women acting out comic scenes, laughter ringing loud across the night. Music and dance were not only for joy but also for healing and protection. Priests used chants to soothe the sick, believing rhythm and melody carried divine power. Mothers sang protective songs over their children at night, hoping to guard them from evil spirits. Work songs, festival hymns, and love songs all carried magic in their words, an unseen force that gave strength and hope. As night fell and the stars scattered across the desert sky, the sounds of Egypt did not fade into silence. Somewhere a flute played softly, somewhere children clapped in rhythm, somewhere families laughed over a game of senet. Music, dance, and entertainment were not luxuries but necessities, reminders that even in a world of toil and hardship, the human heart sought joy. And so, in the villages and fields, in courtyards and along the banks of the Nile, ordinary Egyptians lived not only by bread and beer, but also by song, laughter, and dance. Their voices and footsteps, though lost to time, still echo in the imagination. Reminders that joy has always been as essential as survival. Homes in ancient Egypt were humble for most people, but they carried warmth and practicality, shaped by the sun, the river, and the rhythm of daily survival. Villages spread along the fertile strip of land by the Nile, their mud brick houses standing close together, forming narrow lanes where neighbors greeted each other. Children played and animals wandered freely. Life inside these houses was simple, yet every detail revealed how ordinary Egyptians adapted to their environment. The majority of homes were built from mud bricks, made by mixing Nile silt with straw and drying the blocks in the sun. Stone was too costly, reserved for temples and tombs, so the living chose clay that could be shaped and rebuilt with each generation. The walls were thick, keeping interiors cool during scorching summer days and warm in the chilly winter nights. Roofs were flat, made of wooden beams covered with palm leaves and mud. These roofs were not wasted space. They became sleeping areas in hot weather, storage places for grain or tools, and sometimes even small gardens where pots of herbs grew. Inside, the houses were sparsely furnished. A few stools or low benches offered seating. Woven reed mats covered the floors, and wooden chests held clothes and belongings. Most families did not have beds as we imagine them today. Instead, they slept on mats or low platforms with headrests carved from wood or stone. Walls were often left bare, though wealthier villagers sometimes painted simple decorations or hung amulets for protection. Light came from small oil lamps, their flickering flames casting long shadows across mud walls. Everyday life revolved around the central room, where meals were prepared and family members gathered. A small clay hearth served as the cooking place, with pots and pans of pottery or copper set over the fire. Smoke drifted through holes in the roof, leaving the air heavy with the smell of burning fuel and simmering food. Storage jars lined the walls, filled with grain, beans, dried fish, or beer. Bread was baked in clay ovens just outside the house, the flat round loaves carried inside for meals. The courtyard was often the heart of the home. Chickens scratched in the dirt, goats and sheep were tethered nearby, and children ran barefoot, playing with sticks, clay toys, or small carved animals. Women sat in the shade, grinding grain on stone querns, weaving baskets or spinning thread. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, or carved wood for furniture and household items. Life flowed easily between inside and outside, the courtyard a place of both work and laughter. Villages themselves were close-knit. Houses stood side by side, their walls often sharing support, with narrow streets winding like veins between them. Neighbors depended on one another. When a roof collapsed, others came to help rebuild. During festivals, families shared food and drink. During illness, neighbors cared for the sick. Privacy was minimal, but community bonds were strong, and the rhythm of life was shared. Beyond the village lay the fields, stretching in green rows thanks to the Nile's gift of water. Farmers worked from dawn to dusk, but the village was their refuge at night. From the rooftops, one could look out across the darkening landscape, the river reflecting the stars, and hear the hum of voices, the laughter of children, and the occasional bark of a dog. These villages, though small and simple, were the beating heart of Egypt, where the majority of the population lived, loved, and struggled. In wealthier households, life was somewhat different. Larger homes had multiple rooms, painted walls, wooden furniture, and finer decorations. Servants tended animals, cooked meals, and fetched water. Still, even these houses were built from the same mud bricks, facing the same sun, standing under the same desert sky. Rich or poor, all depended on the Nile, the land, and their community. The village was not just a cluster of houses, but a living, breathing organism. Its narrow streets echoed with gossip. Its courtyards rang with laughter, and its rooftops carried silent prayers whispered into the night. This was home, fragile, temporary, yet filled with resilience, a place where ordinary Egyptians carved out their existence, shaping clay into shelter, and turning hardship into life. Scene 11. As centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, and pharaohs came and went. Yet through it all, the life of ordinary Egyptians remained remarkably steady. Pharaohs might command armies, priests might raise temples of stone, but the farmer still bent over his field. The fisherman still cast his net. The craftsman still shaped his tools, and the mother still sang her lullaby. Their lives were humble, often invisible in the grand monuments of history, yet they were the foundation upon which all of Egypt rested. The pyramids could not have stood without the labor of thousands of workers who hauled stones under the blazing sun. The temples could not have been built without the taxes paid in grain by villages along the Nile. The wealth of Egypt, the gold, the art, the learning, was drawn from the sweat of those who lived in mud brick homes, who baked bread in clay ovens, who sang work songs as they harvested the fields. They were not kings or generals, but they were Egypt itself. Daily life was not easy. Disease was common, accidents frequent, and life expectancy short compared to today. Yet joy was always present, woven into the ordinary. Families gathered for meals of bread, beer, and vegetables. Children played games in the dust, laughing freely. Villagers sang to the gods, hoping for fertile floods and gentle weather. Music, stories, and festivals brightened the darkness. In this balance of hardship and hope, the Egyptians endured. What is striking is not their monuments, but their humanity. They loved and feared, worked and rested, dreamed and prayed, much as people do today. They worried about harvests, celebrated births, mourned deaths, and looked to the stars for meaning. Their gods may seem distant to us, their customs strange, but their hearts beat with the same rhythm of life that echoes through all human history. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often picture pharaohs, pyramids, and treasure. But the real story lies in the lives of ordinary men and women. They were the silent builders of civilization. Without them, there would be no great monuments, no dynasties, no Egypt as we know it. Their footprints may be faint in the sand, but they shaped a legacy that has endured for thousands of years. And so, the story of the ordinary Egyptians is a reminder. Greatness is not only found in kings or monuments, but also in the daily labor of those who rise with the sun, work with their hands, care for their families, and keep faith in the face of hardship. The pyramids may stand as symbols of eternity, but it was the humble lives of farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, servants, and mothers that gave Egypt its soul. The desert winds have long since scattered their songs, and the Nile has carried their voices far away. Yet if one listens closely, one can still imagine the sound of laughter in a village courtyard, the rhythm of oars in the river, the chant of farmers in the fields, and the whisper of prayers rising into the night sky. These were the voices of Egypt's true strength. And though time has passed and empires have crumbled, the essence of their lives, resilient, enduring, and deeply human, still speaks to us today.